The needle was the first thing she packed. Not the good shears, not the velvet case of bone buttons her mother had left her, not even the small tin of beeswax that kept her thread from knotting in cold weather. The needle first. It was a habit she couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't spent years learning that everything else could be improvised. Thread found, scissors borrowed, pins stolen from a dressmaker's floor without guilt. But a good needle was irreplaceable. This one was long and finely tapered, barely thicker than a horse's eyelash, and it caught the morning light through the cottage window like a sliver of the sun itself had been hammered flat. Miriam wrapped it in a square of linen and set it at the bottom of her bag. Then she packed everything else. The letter had come 3 days prior, delivered not by a royal post rider but by a servant in gray livery who hadn't looked at her once while he read it aloud. The Duke of Carevaux required a seamstress of demonstrated skill. She had been recommended, the letter did not say by whom, and was expected at the estate no later than the first frost of the week. Compensation would be discussed upon arrival. She was to bring her own tools. Miriam had listened to the letter with her hands still, which was unusual for her. Her hands were rarely still. She was 26. She had run her own small workroom for 4 years, tucked behind the chandler's shop on the lower quarter of Aldermere, where the smell of tallow and her own fabric scraps mixed into something she'd stopped noticing long ago. Her clients were merchants' wives, the occasional minor official's daughter, once a woman who said she was the mistress of a magistrate and needed a gown that could be packed flat without wrinkling. Miriam had sewn it without comment. That was the work. You learned not to ask about the life that needed dressing. The estate was called Carevaux. She had heard of it the way everyone in Aldermere had, distantly, as one hears of weather in another province. The Duke was named Lucius. He was not old, people said, but he conducted himself as though he were, which some found impressive and others found cold. He had no wife. He had a seat in the king's privy council. He had, it was said, recently returned from the Northern Territories under circumstances no one explained clearly, which meant the circumstances were either shameful or secret. And in Miriam's experience, those two things were rarely different. She did not think much about him on the road. She thought about the needle. Carevaux announced itself before she saw it. The smell of the grounds came first. Wood smoke and turned earth and something sharper underneath, like iron left in the rain. Then the gate, taller than she'd expected. The stone columns flanking it worn smooth at shoulder height where hands had touched them over decades, maybe centuries. The servant who met her at the gate was a woman named Priscilla, who was perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had decided long ago to reveal nothing and had kept that decision faithfully. "You're the seamstress," Priscilla said. "I am. You're younger than I expected." Miriam didn't answer that. There was no answer that would serve her. She was shown to a room on the east wing's second floor, which was more than she'd anticipated. She had expected something near the servants' quarters, and left with a basin of water and the instruction that she would be received in the morning. The room had one window that looked out over a kitchen garden gone largely to seed. A stone bench sat at the garden's center, surrounded by the skeletal remains of what had once been an ambitious herb arrangement. Someone had planted it with care. No one had tended it since. Miriam unpacked her needle first. She met Lucius the following morning in a room he used as a study, though it looked less like a place of work and more like a place where a man went to stand still and call it thinking. Books lined 2 walls, but several shelves held objects. A brass compass, a rolled document sealed with wax she couldn't read, a small painted portrait turned face inward against the shelf's back. He was standing when she entered, which she noted. Men of his position did not usually stand when a seamstress entered. He was tall enough that she was aware of it without it being remarkable. His dark coat was well made, but the left cuff had been repaired. She saw it immediately, the way she always saw such things, the thread color slightly off, the tension uneven. Someone had tried to mend it and hadn't known what they were doing. "Miriam of Aldermere," Priscilla announced, and left before Miriam could decide whether she'd wanted her to stay. "The work," Lucius said, without preamble, without the usual curtsies that men of his rank deployed like furniture, "is not decorative." "I didn't assume it was, Your Grace." He looked at her then. Not the way men looked at her. She was not unaware of how she appeared, dark-eyed and composed in a way that occasionally unsettled people who expected deference, but the way a person looks at something that has surprised them by being solid. "There is a tapestry," he said, "in the great hall. It requires restoration. I'd like to see it. You'll see it when I've explained what's at stake. She waited. Her hands were still. What he explained, carefully, with the particular precision of a man accustomed to being believed because of his title and therefore unused to actually making his case, was this. The tapestry in the Great Hall of Caraval was not merely decorative, it was a legal document. Or rather, it had been used as one. 3 generations prior, a boundary dispute between the Caraval lands and the Crown territory to the north had been resolved not through written treaty, both parties had mistrusted each other's scribes, but through a commissioned tapestry, stitched to illustrate the agreed boundary markers, the shared waterways, the seasonal grazing rights along the eastern ridge. 2 copies had been made. One had been destroyed in a fire at the northern garrison. The one in the Great Hall of Caraval remained the sole surviving record of an agreement that was, at this present moment, being contested. By whom, he did not say. What he said instead was, it's damaged. How damaged? The eastern panel. The section depicting the ridge markers. It's been... He paused, and something moved behind his composure that she couldn't name. Interfered with. She absorbed that word. Interfered with. You mean deliberately. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it either, which told her more than confirmation would have. If the boundary record cannot be verified, he said, the Crown's appointed examiner will rule the agreement void. The northern territories will revert to disputed status. There are people, and here his voice did something careful, who stand to benefit considerably from that outcome. Miriam thought about the kitchen garden, the skeletal herbs, the portrait turned face inward on the shelf. When is the examiner expected? 12 days. She said nothing for a moment. Then, I'd like to see the tapestry now, Your Grace. It was extraordinary, even damaged. She stood in front of it for a long time without speaking, which Lucius, standing a measured distance behind her, because he seemed to understand instinctively that she needed space the way she needed light, allowed without comment. It was perhaps 4 feet tall and 12 wide, worked in wool and silk thread on a linen ground, and whoever had made it had been not merely skilled, but possessed. The colors had aged into something richer than they'd likely started. The greens deepened to the color of still water, the golds gone amber, the reds holding a warmth that newer thread couldn't match. The eastern panel was wrong in a way that anyone who knew fabric would see, and anyone who didn't would likely miss entirely. A section roughly 18 inches wide had been restitched, not restored, restitched. New thread in old colors, or an attempt at old colors, and whoever had done it had known enough to be dangerous and not enough to be convincing. The ridge markers, small meticulous symbols woven into what appeared to be a pastoral landscape, had been altered. She could see the ghost of the original stitching beneath, the pulled threads, the compressed linen where the original work had been removed. They changed the markers, she said. Yes, the original is still there. Underneath, a pause. Is it recoverable? She crouched, which was not a posture that concerned her regardless of his presence, and brought her face close to the panel. The linen ground was intact. They'd pulled threads, not cut them. Whoever had done the restitching had been in a hurry, or had been frightened, or both, because they'd left the original warp and weft undisturbed. And on an old piece like this, that was where the truth lived. She stood. It's recoverable, she said. But I'll need to work in here in this light, and I'll need it to myself. Lucius was quiet for a moment. In the light of the hall, she could see that the repaired cuff of his coat was on the arm he'd extended toward the tapestry. He'd been gesturing, as he explained, and hadn't thought about it. And she found that detail almost unbearably human for a man who'd otherwise held himself like a sealed room. The household staff will be instructed, he said. Whatever you need. She nodded. Then, because it needed saying, 12 days is enough, but only if nothing else goes wrong. He looked at her with an expression she didn't yet have a name for. Not gratitude. It was too early for gratitude. Something more like the recognition of a weight being, against expectations shared. I'll see to it, he said. Miriam turned back to the tapestry. She was already thinking about the needle. She began on the second morning. The great hall in early light was a different room than it was at any other hour. The high windows faced east, and for approximately 2 hours after sunrise, the light came in at an angle that made the tapestry's surface readable in a way that no candle or lamp could replicate. Thread, cast, shadow. Shadow revealed structure. This was how you learned what had been done to something, and more importantly, what remained beneath the doing. Miriam worked on a low stool she'd asked Priscilla to find her, close enough to the panel that her breath occasionally disturbed the older threads. She did not begin by stitching. She began by looking, then by touching, the pad of her index finger moving across the reworked section with a pressure lighter than a moth's landing, reading the thread the way some people claim to read scripture, as though the truth of it were there if you slowed down enough to receive it. It was worse than she'd shown Lucius. Not in terms of the damage. The original work was largely intact beneath, as she'd said, but in terms of what the alteration revealed about its author. This had not been done by someone ignorant of tapestry work. The color matching alone required knowledge. Whoever had sourced the replacement thread had known to age it, had soaked it in something tannic to dull its newness, had understood that fresh dye reads differently against old fiber. They had simply not understood, or had not had time to understand, that aged thread also loses tension, that it settles into the linen with a particular laxity that new thread, however treated, cannot fake. She could read the hurry in it, the fear in it, almost. She thought about that while she worked, slowly unpicking the false stitching with a tool so small it was nearly invisible in her fingers, a stiletto awl she'd had since her apprenticeship, its handle worn to the shape of her palm. Each thread she removed, she set on a square of white cloth beside her. By mid-morning she had a small pile of them, the evidence of an interference that once removed would exist nowhere except that cloth square in her own memory. She was not sure yet what to do about that. Lucius did not come to the hall that first day, which she had expected. He came on the second, early, before she'd fully settled into the work, and she heard him stop behind her at a distance that was careful without being remote. "Progress," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Some." She didn't look up. "The false stitching is almost fully removed. I'll begin reconstruction today. And the original markers, they're intact. All 5 of them." She did look up then, because this next part mattered, and she wanted to see his face when she said it. Whoever altered this knew what they were changing. The markers correspond to something real. They weren't moved randomly. His face did not change exactly, but something behind it did. "The ridge boundary," he said. "The 3rd marker has been moved approximately." She paused, because she wanted to be precise. 2 inches to the west in the restitching. In scale, given the tapestry's proportions, that represents a shift of perhaps a quarter mile on the actual terrain. Silence. "A quarter mile," he said. "That contains the Vera spring." She hadn't known what it contained. She knew now by the way he said it, quiet, and with the particular flatness of a man absorbing something he had already half known but had not wanted to confirm. "Who has access to this hall?" she asked. It was not her place to ask. She asked anyway. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "The hall is not locked. It hasn't been, historically. There was no reason." He paused. "My steward Barnabas manages the household inventory. He would have overseen any contracted work on the estate." The name landed in the room and stayed there. Miriam turned back to the tapestry. "I'll need 4 more days for the reconstruction. The thread matching is the difficulty. I brought materials, but for the older greens I'll need to source something closer. Tell Priscilla what you need. She'll send to the city. Tell her the dye base is weld and wode, over-dyed, and it needs to have been stored a long time. Not new stock aged artificially, actually old. There are merchant houses in Aldermere that carry legacy thread for restoration work. She'll know which." He was still behind her. She was aware of him, the way she was aware of the light, as a condition of the room, something that affected how she saw everything else. "You know a great deal," he said. Not accusatory, almost wondering. "About thread?" she said. Yes, the days settled into a pattern that was, in its quietness, almost domestic. She worked mornings in the hall. Afternoons she spent at the table in her room, preparing thread, making the tiny color-by-color decisions that restoration demanded. This green against that one held to the window. The difference between them visible only if you trained your eye for years to see it. Evenings she ate in a small room off the kitchen that Priscilla had arranged for her, which she preferred to the formality of the dining room, and which had the additional advantage of being where Priscilla herself ate. And Priscilla, once she'd decided Miriam was worth speaking to, turned out to be a source of considerable information delivered entirely without appearing to be. She learned that Barnabas had been at Caraval for 11 years, That he had a brother in the Northern Territories? A land agent, Priscilla said, with a particular care in her voice that meant she'd said as much as she intended to. That Lucius had inherited the estate at 22 when his father died, and had spent the years since in a kind of sustained, effortful duty that left very little room for anything else. "He doesn't sleep enough," Priscilla said on the third evening, not looking up from her bread. Miriam said nothing. "He was up past the second bell last night. I saw the study light." She broke off a piece of crust. "He does that when something's worrying him." "Things are worrying him," Miriam said. "Things are always worrying him. This is different." Priscilla finally looked at her. "You're different. Most people he commissions to do a task he forgets about until the task is done. He's not forgetting about you." Miriam looked at her hands. There was a faint green stain on her right index finger from the thread she'd been working that afternoon. "I have his legal record in my lap for 6 hours a day," she said. "It would be strange if he weren't attentive." Priscilla made a small sound that communicated efficiently that she considered this explanation insufficient. On the 7th day, Miriam found the second alteration. She had been working on the reconstruction, the new stitching going in cleanly now, the matched thread holding its color against the original in a way that satisfied her. Not perfect, it would never be perfect. Restoration never was, but honest, which was the only standard that actually mattered. She'd been so focused on the markers that she'd almost missed it. A small section of the lower border, decorative, seemingly, a running pattern of stylized oak leaves that framed the bottom edge of the entire tapestry. In the eastern panel, 3 of those oak leaves had been restitched, and she had initially registered it and moved on, assuming it was prior restoration work, old and irrelevant. It was not old. The thread was the same as the false marker stitching. Same dye treatment, same hand. She sat back on her stool and looked at it for a long time. The oak leaf pattern was not merely decorative. She saw it slowly, the way you see a face in a crowd. First nothing, then suddenly the only thing. The leaves were symbolic. They marked, in the convention of the period in which the tapestry had been made, the witnessing parties. Each stylized leaf represented a signatory to the agreement, not by name, but by the particular arrangement of the leaf's veining, which would have been meaningful to those who commissioned it, and meaningless to anyone who didn't know the look. One of the restitched leaves had had its veining altered. A witness had been changed. She put down her awl. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed slowly, because what she was looking at was not just evidence of a boundary dispute. It was evidence of something larger, a falsified witness that moved this from the territory of property law into something that had a different name entirely. She went to find Lucius. She had never gone to the study uninvited. She knocked, and his voice came immediately, as though he'd been awake for hours, which he probably had. She showed him what she'd found, not by bringing him to the tapestry, but by showing him the thread she'd removed, laid on the white cloth, and a diagram she'd made in the margin of her workbook, precise and clear. She explained the leaf convention. She explained what the altered veining indicated. She watched him understand it in stages, each stage costing him something. "This changes what you'll be able to tell the examiner," she said. "Yes, the documentation you present can't just be the restored tapestry. You'll need someone who can testify to the state of the damage and the nature of the restoration, to stand behind what I've recovered and explain it." He looked at her. "That would be you. That would be me." She held his gaze. "I want to be clear, Your Grace, about what I'm offering. I can restore this tapestry to the truth of its original. I can document every thread I've removed and every stitch I've replaced with enough detail that the work itself constitutes a record. And I can stand in front of your examiner and explain it in terms he cannot dismiss." She paused. "But that is not what you hired me for." The room was very quiet. "No," Lucius said, "it isn't. So I'm telling you plainly what I bring to this. Not asking your permission, telling you. Because the examiner arrives in 5 days, and the tapestry is not the only thing in this room that needs to be honest. Something in him, that sealed, careful composure he'd worn like his well-made coat, came undone. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough." His hand, resting on the desk, opened slightly, as though releasing something he'd been holding closed for a long time. "I underestimated what you came here to do," he said, quietly, meaning it. "Most people do." She said it without anger. It was simply true. And truth, in her experience, was most useful when delivered without performance. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the testimony you're describing, it would put you in direct opposition to Barnabas and to whoever he's acting for. I know. That's not a trivial risk for a seamstress from Aldenmere. She looked at him steadily. I'm aware of what I am. I'm also aware of what I can do. Those two things have never been the same size, and I stopped being troubled by that a long time ago. He looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she'd arrived, which was strange given how often she'd felt his attention in the hall. This was different. This was the look of a man discovering that the ground he'd been standing on was more solid than he'd known, and that it had been solid all along, and the failure had been entirely in his assessment. Miriam, he said. Her name, just her name, without the title she didn't have. Your Grace. Lucius. He paused. If we're being honest. The needle was still in her pocket. It always was. She felt the faint press of it through the fabric, thin and certain, and thought, yes, if we're being honest. Lucius, she said. The examiner arrived on the 10th day, a precise man named Silas, who wore his authority like a garment he'd owned long enough to stop noticing. He stood before the tapestry for a long time. He asked questions. Miriam answered them, all of them, with her workbook open, with the removed threads on their white cloth, with the diagram and her notation of the leaf convention. She spoke clearly and without apology, and she watched Silas's expression move through skepticism and into something she recognized as the reluctant respect of a man confronting competence he hadn't budgeted for. Barnabas, present at the examination as a state steward, said very little. His face said everything Miriam needed to know about what he understood. The examiner ruled the agreement intact. He ruled the alteration deliberate. He recommended further inquiry into its authorship. That inquiry was not Miriam's to conduct. Her work was done. The tapestry was done. The truth of it restored stitch by careful stitch. And it hung in the great hall with its eastern panel whole again, the markers in their rightful place, the witnesses properly witnessed. She stood in front of it the evening after the examiner left, alone in the hall, in the last of the light. She heard him before she saw him. His step, which she'd learned. Lucius came to stand beside her. Not behind her this time, beside her. And they looked at the tapestry together in the fading light. And for a while, neither of them spoke. You're going to tell me you'll return to Aldenmere, he said. I have a workroom. Clients. Yes, he was quiet. I want to ask you not to. I'm aware I haven't earned that yet. Yet? That word, small and forward-facing, landed in her chest with a weight that was not unpleasant. She looked at the tapestry, at the ridge markers restored to their truth, at the border of oak leaves, their veining honest, their witnesses real, at 12 days of work that had begun as an ordinary commission and had become something she didn't yet have the right name for. The kitchen garden, she said. He paused. What about it? It was planted by someone who knew what they were doing. It's been neglected. It has? That seems like a waste. He turned to look at her profile, and she let him look, and the evening light was the color of the tapestry's old gold thread, warm and long settled, and entirely itself. It does, he said softly. She did not say yes, and she did not say no. She reached into her pocket and turned the needle once between her fingers, thin and certain and irreplaceable, and let the silence hold what words would only have made smaller. Outside, the first frost was beginning to settle over the garden. Tomorrow, it would all need tending. She was, it turned out, not in any hurry to leave.